Why did they do this? Well, there are very obvious reasons. Number one, under the common law, and this is true in America as much as it is here in Britain or in Canada or in Australia, all common law jurisdictions, there are basically only two reasons which will allow you to take a religious organization to court. The first of these is property. If you have a property consideration and through disfellowshipment or excommunication you lose your property, that becomes a secular matter and it can be adjudicated in the courts. The other reason is if a religious organization violates its own rules. Now the question is, how can you determine whether a religious organization has violated its own rules if everything is in a back room, if there are no records kept, if you have no one to represent you, if there are no other witnesses present? How in the world can a court deal with something like that? They can't. Then there is the whole question of dissociation. We've heard about that today. What is that? Well, years ago, the Watchtower Society used to complain bitterly about the Catholic Church not excommunicating Adolf Hitler and a variety of other people. The Catholic answer to that is simple. There are some people who are excommunicated laetae sententiae. By the very fact that you commit a particular act, you are excommunicated. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has borrowed liberally from canon law of the Catholic Church and practices exactly the same thing under different rubrics. In other words, if you are baptized in another religion, or if you should remarry when you're not considered to be free to do so, or a variety of other things, or if you put Christmas decorations on your house, or if you have a party for your 6-year-old child in the celebration of his birthday, you can be disfellowshipped or dissociated just like that. Well, is there scriptural basis for anything like this? One thing that some ex-witnesses fail to recognize is that any meaningful religious organization or secular organization must have rules and must insist that people abide by those rules to be members of those organizations. For instance, if you have a congregation of Christians and you have a man who comes into the congregation and he's a pedophile, you can't say, oh my goodness, we can't do anything about this fellow because the witnesses practice disfellowshipment and some of the Mennonites do, and the Jews, they shun some of their people, the Orthodox Jews. So we can't be hard-hearted like that, and we've got to be loving and forgiving. I think that there's what I call a feather-headed approach on the part of certain evangelicals, and they'll say, when you've been terribly hurt by somebody, oh, you've got to forgive. Personally, I think that the Bible teaches that forgiveness only follows repentance on the part of the person who has committed the sin. If you can't do anything about it, leave it with God. But that doesn't mean that you go and say, oh, you're forgiven, when the person is an outright malefactor. And you don't want to let a pedophile loose in a congregation, do you? It doesn't make any sense. When people violate the rules of a group in an immoral way, something needs to be done about that person. And the scriptures teach this, and very clearly teach it. And they do at, I believe it's the 5th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Many of you are familiar with this. And it's dealing really with immoral persons. If you look at 1 Corinthians 5 verses 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral men, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world, but rather I wrote you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber, not even to eat with such a one. Now there's no doubt about this. And there are other passages, such as the one in Titus that deals with the creation of a sect. But the one that the Watchtower likes to use, of course, is in one of the epistles of John, and what it says specifically is this in 2 John, beginning really at verse 8. Look to yourself that you may not lose what you have worked for, but may win a full reward. Anyone who goes ahead and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into the house or give him any greeting, for he who greets him shares in his wicked work. Now, who is this talking about? Is this talking about someone who has left the witnesses and gone into the Methodist Church, become an Anglican, joined a Bible student group? Is it talking about people like that? Well, if you go back a few verses, about verse 6, and this is love, that we follow his commandments. This is the commandment, as you have heard from the beginning, that you follow love. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, men who will not acknowledge the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist. What's this talking about? Well, as a church historian, I'm very familiar with what it's talking about. In the period of the early church, from the 2nd century on, there were a great many sects that are generally known as Gnostic sects, Gnosticism. Most of these sects, influenced by heathen ideas, believed that anything that was material was evil. The flesh was evil. Many of them refused to eat meat. Many of them refused to have sexual intercourse because they wanted to escape the flesh. So, what many of them said was this: Jesus Christ really couldn't have been fleshly. Jesus Christ came as a spirit or a phantom and simply appeared as a materialized person. And one sect even went so far as to say that when Jesus was taken to be crucified, he exchanged positions with Simon of Cyrene and stood by laughing while they crucified Simon. Now these were the Gnostic groups, you see, and they said specifically that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh. Now this was a terrible heresy. It was denying the manhood of Jesus Christ. Those were the persons that they weren't even to greet or speak to. How many people among ex-Jehovah's Witnesses teach such a doctrine or say that Jesus Christ didn't come in the flesh? It's utter nonsense. They have twisted the scriptures in the worst way imaginable. I know of so many cases, terrible cases, friends. You've heard some of them here, the effects of disfellowshipment. I've talked to several of the sisters here. It was a real privilege to hear their experiences on a first-hand basis. I wanted to cry. I want to tell you what it was like to have been an elder in some of those judicial hearings. I sat in judicial hearings where young couples would be brought in, charged with fornication. And some of the elders would turn to the young woman, sometime a girl of 15, 16, 17 years of age. Where did you lie when you had intercourse? How were you positioned? How far did he penetrate you? Can you imagine the psychological impact of middle-aged men getting their jollies? Sitting there questioning a tender young girl, something like this. Disgusting is the only word for it. Disgusting. I've known men, too, to suffer terribly. When I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa in the States many years ago, there was a fellow in our congregation. His name was Rudy Hoover. Rudy and his wife loved one another. But Rudy's wife was not healthy. It was very painful for her to have marital relations with him. And he was a very virile man and felt that he needed a sexual relationship. The result was that he became involved with another woman, committed adultery. He begged to be reinstated. He wanted help. He sought the elders. Complete coldness. Absolute coldness. One day I was sitting in a restaurant down in the center of the city, small city, about 30,000 people. We were right beside a tavern. I was there with some of the other students. We heard 2 shots, 2 pistol shots. We all got up and ran out in the street. Rudy had gone in, felt that this woman was destroying his hope for everlasting life, that she had seduced him, felt that he had no hope. He killed her, he killed himself. I know dozens of cases of attempted suicide. I know so many cases of parents being separated from their children, children from their parents. Brother Ron Fry, beautiful brother, hasn't seen his children, his one daughter, his granddaughter, or his great-granddaughter. The only time he's seen any member of his family for years is when his mother died, and she refused to see him before she died. People are cut off over and over again. We were fortunate, our whole family came out. My aged uncle, my wife's mother, very intelligent woman who had gone through University of Pittsburgh, Columbia University. She came out. My mother came out. My father was dead at the time. My niece, my nephew, my wife's brother and his wife, our 2 sons, our daughter, our daughters-in-law. Our older son and his wife are now divorced, although they're quite good friends and have a good relationship with regard to the children. The children are now grown. This girl was cut off completely by her family. She called my wife and said to Marilyn, "You're far more a mother to me than my own mother." 2 sets of my grandchildren do not know their own grandparents. Disfellowshipping is the watchtower's weapon, and if this is broken, if they relent on this, or are forced to relent on this, the whole system will come tumbling down. People will start getting blood transfusions tomorrow. They'll start putting up Christmas trees. They'll have birthday parties. They'll be pretty much like everybody else. This is the weapon, the control weapon. The organization, however, is riding a bicycle. It knows that if it stops, it's going to fall off. And yet it's in a position now where it knows that it has to change. It's in a very, very difficult position. It no longer has a date to look forward to. On top of that, it's losing great numbers of publishers. The internet is exposing its sins. And I want to tell you this, friends, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow. I believe that while we need to practice defensive court action, such as in custody cases and in blood transfusion cases, I think it is a gross mistake to take the Watchtower Society to court in other areas. And I'll tell you why.